It's now 6:31, and we will call to order the Astoria Planning Commission. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Herman.
Here.
Commissioner Moore.
Here.
Commissioner Kim Lacek.
Here.
Chair Fitzpatrick.
Here. Okay, we have the March 27th, 2018 minutes for approval.
I have one change on page 10 of the minutes. After the large paragraph, there are comments attributed to myself and to Commissioner Henry, and I think that our names are just reversed. I believe that she said that first part, and then I said the second part.
So she was uncomfortable approving,
Right.
Commissioner Henry was uncomfortable approving the S2A zone because of the outright uses and would be more willing to discuss the S2, and
Right,
Commissioner...
and then I talked about the Advance Astoria initiative.
So Commissioner Cameron Laddick, for the record, said she was sympathetic to the problems with trying to do something with land that is zoned for a market that does not exist. Okay, so since we are on that subject, we will note for the record that Commissioner Henry has joined us. And would you agree with Commissioner Cameron Laddick?
Yes.
Okay. Any other changes? Okay.
I move that we approve the minutes as corrected.
I'll second that.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. The Astoria Planning Commission will handle several matters tonight with a public hearing. Actually, one matter tonight with a public hearing. The order I'm going to follow is outlined in a handout called Procedures for Conduct of Public Hearings, available from staff. Scheduled public hearings are itemized on the agenda. In each case, I will identify the subject, announce when the public hearing is open, and ask anyone interested to testify regarding the matter. If you wish to speak, please be sure to sign the hearing sign-in sheet located on the side tables. Do we have a sign-in sheet and side tables?
Yes.
We do. Adjacent to Planner Ferber. You should address your remarks to whether or not the application in question meets the necessary criteria. The significant criteria that apply to each issue are listed in the staff report, which staff has available. If you fail to raise an issue in person or by letter to the Astoria Planning Commission or City Council, an appeal of that issue would not be permitted. And what was going to be our first public hearing, which would be an amendment request by Kevin Cronin for a change in zoning from S1 to S2, S1 Marine Industrial to S2 General Shoreland, has been, to my knowledge, withdrawn.
Correct.
And so that will not be heard tonight. And we will move on to our public hearing tonight is conditional use 18-02 by Mike Oyen. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's spelled O-I-E-N for the record. DBA Terry's Plumbing to locate a plumbing shop, contract construction service in an existing building at 415 Gateway Street. Does anyone object to the jurisdiction of the Astoria Planning Commission to hear this matter at this time? Does any member of the Astoria Planning Commission feel he or she has a conflict of interest or any ex parte contacts to declare?
I'll note for the record that I happened to drive by the location by coincidence today and did look at it again.
Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Moore. Could we have a presentation of the staff report and recommendation?
Yes, I printed off some photos because we don't have visuals tonight, and I know photos are helpful, so those are in front of you of the site. Mike Morgan actually wrote up this report. Pretty straightforward request for contract construction services. I did want to note that that definition is not actually defined in our development code, which makes it a little tricky, but it's also pretty self-explanatory. So it's kind of subjective of what falls under that category, but I think a plumbing shop is pretty much key for what this is. The site should be familiar because we looked at a similar conditional use for the education daycare services adjacent to this property a while back, which was approved, and it's right next door. There is an applicant here who can better answer kind of the site plan and layout, but it's all included in the staff report, and there are only a few recommendations that signage should be included. We need a copy of the lease, especially from the port, and if there are any plans to delineate sidewalks and parking, that the port would be responsible for the timing and funding of that. And then we also need a plan for enclosing any sort of garbage or recycling. I didn't see that one in there, but those are pretty minor and can be submitted later on.
Great. Are there any questions for staff from the commissioners? Okay. Public testimony is now open. If you wish to speak, please come to the front of the room. State your name and address for the record. Is there a presentation by the applicant?
No.
Do commissioners have questions of the applicant? Is there a presentation by persons in favor of the application? Is there a presentation by persons who would speak impartial to the application? Is there a presentation by persons who would speak against the application? Is there rebuttal testimony from the applicant? For the record, the silence deems that nobody had anything to say. Are there closing remarks from staff? Public hearing is now closed. The commission will now discuss the issue, deliberate, and come to a decision.
Seems like a good spot for a plumbing business.
Okay.
I don't have any issue with it.
I'm satisfied that the criteria is met.
I'm also comfortable with the staff report findings.
Great.
Same.
Great. And those comments were from Commissioner Herman, Commissioner Moore, Commissioner Cameron Laddick, and Commissioner Henry in that order. I would agree. It seems to be an appropriate location for that use. So, do we have a motion?
I will move that the Astoria Planning Commission adopt the findings and conclusions contained in the staff report CU 18-02 with the and approve the conditional use request by Mike Owen, DBA Terry's Plumbing.
I'll second that motion.
Moved by Commissioner Moore, seconded by Commissioner Herman. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. The Astoria Planning Commission's ruling may be appealed by any person withstanding to the City Council within 15 days of the mailing of the Astoria Planning Commission order. Appeals shall be in writing and shall be filed with the Community Development Director. If an appeal is not filed with the city within the 15-day period, the decision of the Astoria Planning Commission shall be final. The permit will be void after 2 years unless substantial construction has taken place or use has begun. However, the Astoria Planning Commission may extend the permit for an additional 1 year upon request by the applicant. Thank you for coming. Okay, next item on the agenda is our work session, and that would be a review proposal of code amendments to address emergency shelters.
So I included a very brief memo because I actually missed the previous work sessions that Mike took you through. But basically we've included the language that we reviewed the first time and then some edits from Commissioner Moore. I also sent around an email received from Dan Parkinson, and I believe Commissioner
Mitchell.
thank you, sent a letter which Dan wants to read, and I also passed it around just so we have it on record.
Great. Joan, did you want to go ahead and read that?
Go
Or
ahead and read that right now.
Okay.
Let me just get it out. Okay. Fellow Commissioners, I am unable to be in Astoria and voting on the proposed ordinance. I have asked that the following comments be read for me. The proposed Emergency Shelter Code amendment, as written, would eliminate all the downtown churches with a location and capacity to serve as a temporary homeless shelter. First Methodist, R3, First Presbyterian, R3, First Baptist, C4, and Peace Lutheran, C4. Our older churches are the entities with the mission, building capacity, congregations, and continuity to take on this challenge. No community organization or commercial enterprise carries these same traits. There is no public acclaim or profit to be made by serving the homeless population. It requires a large number of volunteers willing to give their time during difficult hours. Significant investment has been made at First Methodist, including laundry facilities and a shower, allowing those who are able to seek employment and maintain their physical health to do so. Local restaurants and the food web help with food, often that which might otherwise be thrown away. The building works for the shelter, and controls requested by the neighborhood have been put in place. So I have to wonder, is that the intent of the proposal? If the Commission and the Astoria City Council want to provide a working ordinance which sets boundaries but allows a temporary shelter during the winter months, this proposed ordinance must be changed to include the following. Altering the proposal to use the Oregon Fire Code Technical Advisory as provided by Mr. Parkinson and supported by our fire department and building officials, including temporary warming shelter as conditional use in zone districts R3 and C4, using the occupant load ratio of persons served to square feet of room area as suggested, rather than an arbitrary number. It is my perception that such changes would allow a continuation of the service and protection of surrounding neighborhoods. It speaks to who we wish to be as a community. I request your assistance in making these changes. The churches I have called out each serve a community outreach function, which may impinge on the surrounding neighborhood. Meals and activities for a younger population, childcare, the warming center, and a meeting hall used by local groups for performances and holiday sales. They add to our livability and provide service to broader populations. I am very sorry that I am unable to be at this commission meeting or able to vote on the ordinance. I hope that you will consider my requests.
Thank you, Commissioner Herman. Okay.
So to move forward with these code amendments, we would need a kind of final deliberation and direction to staff, and then we'd come back at the following planning commission meeting with actual code to adopt, to recommend to send to council. So that's sort of where we are process-wise, but I am happy to take notes, or I'm not sure if you want to open it up to public for public input at this point.
Sure. Well, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to clarify that I don't think we're voting on anything tonight, although we will be discussing. And again, this is just from the letter that was just read.
Yep.
I hope that Jan will be able to attend the meeting when we do have a vote.
Yeah, we would only be making a motion tonight to direct staff to bring back the actual amendment, and then Jan could vote
Right.
next time.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would remind the people in the audience, if you're here for this, that it is not a public hearing this evening, but we are happy to take input from those attending. And so I would be happy to have anyone speak. What we would ask is that you give your name and address for the record. And usually we try to limit comments to 3 minutes, but since we have a very short agenda tonight and very few people in the audience, I'm happy to allow greater input than just the 3 minutes. So is there anyone interested in speaking about this evening? So Rick, if you don't mind standing, I guess, and then stating your name and,
Yeah, Rick Bowers, Richard Bowers, 357 Commercial. Just from the way I read it, I think it's talking about Mormon centers or temporary shelters that are greater than or equal to, I don't remember, 10 was the magic number. And I'd just like some clarity somewhere. What happens to if a church or some group wants to do less than that magic number? Are they not allowed? Are they allowed? That's my only.
so your question is if someone wants to do 8 or limited at 6 or something?
Correct.
Okay.
Would they be excluded from doing that within?
So these
No.
amendments
Sorry.
would regulate a warming shelter that served 10 or more.
Okay.
So a shelter that served fewer than 10, you would do it however it's done now, which would be, you can probably just do it unless there's complaints and then the city might get involved. Is that generally how it happens? So a church could operate a temporary shelter like that just on their own.
Okay, so that's not explicit in the code, is that? That would be allowed or not allowed?
No, what
code.
it would be explicit is if you serve 10 or more, then it would fall under these regulations.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Rick.
John, is it possible to comment after you have a bit of discussion to comment on various points?
Well, it's possible. I have that option. I would be willing to consider that, yes. Would you like to comment now, Mr. Hafker?
I would like to hear some of the discussion and some of the points that get brought up, and then maybe add to that towards the end of the discussion.
Okay.
I'd like to do that too.
The same, okay.
I want to listen.
Mr. Parkinson?
Hi, I'm sorry I'm late. My plane, I was in California and just flew back and got delayed.
So the question is, would you like to
Speak.
to comment at this time?
Was the discussion opened up about the different zonings that this may, that Daryl's proposal would apply to?
We have just opened the discussion. We have just opened this portion of the meeting, and there has been virtually no discussion. There was a letter read,
Okay.
a letter by Jan Mitchell, read by Commissioner Herman.
Okay. Yeah, would it be possible for me to speak?
You have the opportunity right now if you would like to. So as I have stated, you would state your name and address for the record.
Okay. Dan Parkinson, 550 State Route 401, Nacelle, Washington, 98638. I live straight across from Safeway.
Okay.
Highway.
Planner Ferber, do you think that the machine is picking it up from that distance?
I hope so. Do you want to come up and chat up in the front row just so we can capture?
We're recording for the record, Mr. Parkinson,
Okay.
and so it's important that anyone who speaks is in the recording.
Okay.
So if you don't mind stating your name and address again, just,
Daniel Parkinson, 550 State Route 401, Nacelle, Washington. I don't live in Nacelle. I live just 3 miles upriver from the edge of the bridge. So when I read the proposal, the discussion that I want to have is on 2 things. One is a warming center by fire code. Most buildings in the city that aren't either a dormitory or a hotel would not have been constructed to what's called an R code. An R code is very specific on exiting. It's very specific on double sheetrock, the floor system, the ceiling system, not necessarily sprinklers, depending on the number of people, but it's a tough code for a developer contractor to meet. There's fire caulking, there's a lot of work that goes in. And because of that, the state fire marshal recognized that, and if warming centers were going to be allowed to operate, he needed to waive the requirements of the R code and the fire in the fire code, which he did in the technical advisory that he issued. I have a copy of it, and Daryl used a lot of it in his workup of this change to the development code. So any typical building, they're not dormitories. And so a downtown, the buildings that are in the zones that have so far been discussed in his proposal, a quick review of them, and we'll do a detailed review, but a quick review shows that those are not our code design. But because the fire marshal issued a technical advisory, I've got a copy of it, I'm not sure it's called that. He said he would waive those requirements for a maximum of 90 days. And that's what the existing Astoria Warming Center was operating in. That's a church, it wasn't built like a hotel. It's okay if we operate for 90 days. Any building that would be a warming center would need, almost any building, would need that waiver, but that waiver exists. Not only for Astoria, it's statewide. The city of Portland has its own fire code. They don't fall under the state, they fall under the city of Portland's fire marshal. They do whatever they want there. That's different. Everybody else, all the small warming centers that are spread out through the state operate under the state fire code. So that consideration is real important to the location of any building. And Daryl's proposal spells out what was in the fire code. My concern is that I think it would be clearer if the state, if that was referenced in the code and made that the guiding document, because that may change. The fire marshal may have, with experience, he may get stricter. There may be other systems that come out. And I think that any building, I think the Astoria should kind of hook their horse to the state fire marshal. I think it's a good idea, rather than this code spelling out a way that is in existence now, but may not be how the fire marshal feels 3 years down the road. He could get tougher. There could be another system out there. So that was the first point I wanted to make. And then the second point I wanted to make was on churches specifically. There's churches in multiple zones in this city. And one of the goals of land use planning, I've always understood it to be to take the highest and best use of a piece of property and allow what is the highest and best use of it as good planning. I think, like the waterfront has specific highest and best uses. Downtown Central Core does. The churches, a warming center only ties up the nighttime part-time of a structure. But by tying it up in the nighttime part-time, it pretty much prevents that building from being used any other way. Like, you can't really say, well, we're gonna have it be an office building during the day and a warming center at night. Churches are unique, and most warming centers are located in churches because most of them have some kind of meeting hall. Warrenton's warming center is located in a church. Salem, Silverton, Eastern Oregon, dozens of warming centers are located in churches, and the reason why they are is because it uses those facilities well. The church has its activities on the weekends, it has choir practice at night, it has stuff going on during the day, but usually there's a facility like a gym or a meeting hall. A lot of times it's got a kitchen, it's got bathrooms that are already built. And so the uniqueness of the church's facility makes it uniquely capable to use a warming center. Summer school can still go on. That works when the kids, they have summer activities, but the wintertime, that facility is usually not used that much. And I really think there's a synergy there, and then also the church's idea of serving the poor, that is a core part of their mission. That's a core part of Christianity. And having talked to multiple ministers here, all of them support the AWC and the idea of a warming center. I don't want to bring AWC into this conversation. They support the idea of a warming center. They feel like that each one of the churches that doesn't have a warming center in there has said that if we didn't have daycare here full time, we would do it. Or if we didn't have AA and NA meetings round the clock, the Baptist church would be perfect. But they have meetings that start at 7 o'clock in the morning and they run till 10:30 at night. And they also have crowds of people around, and that's just kind of the function of what goes on. So to take and limit I would open up the zoning, the idea here of what zone it's allowed in, to any zone that a church is in. Because things may change for the Baptist church. It may become the ideal place. Things may change for some of the other churches. If like somebody builds a daycare facility, the Lutheran church, if they build a daycare facility, then they're going to have a facility that could do that, could take a warming center. And I think that to limit it to the kind of industrial area and the other zones, I don't know the names of them, but I saw them on the map, to limit them to those particular zones. Many of them are right next to a residential zone. I just think it's short-sighted because it's still going to need to go through an approval process, if I'm not mistaken.
Again, we're making a recommendation. We're not doing an approval.
So it's an outright use?
No, we are making a recommendation to the city council. We aren't the ones that make the final decision.
Yeah. No, I mean,
But yeah, it would be a condition, as
it'd be a
it's
conditional
currently designed, it would be a
use in
conditional
any
use.
zone.
Right.
So I would urge
Sorry.
this commission here to consider all the zones that have the types of structures that are uniquely compatible. I think the churches, the Lutheran or the Baptist church is in a commercial zone. I think, I know we're in an R3 zone, and I can't see limiting it because that's where those facilities are. And specifically on the R3 zone, there is, in the conditional uses in the R3 zone, it talks about allowing a boarding house, a rooming house. I brought as already conditional uses. Congregate care, there's lots, like an Oxford house, for instance, would probably be a conditional use, even though it's not exactly spelled out that a rehab facility, where people that were in recovery could stay. Typical Oxford houses have 8 to 10 people in them. Some of the other ones have a lot more, like a congregate care. I've built dozens of those, and they typically run 30 to 100 clients in the facility, and that's a conditional use in an R3. So I just really like to urge you guys to take a look at that. It's all. That's pretty much my comments.
Great, thank you, Mr. Parkinson. Did any of the commissioners have any questions for? Great, thank you. Okay, Planner Ferber, is this something that you would like to lead, or should Mr. Moore take this, or?
You can. I had a quick comment about allowing uses in churches gets a little messy if a church is already existing non-conforming in a residential area, and I'd have to double check because churches fall under semi-public use, which might be allowed in R3. But if you're allowing accessory uses to it, then you're expanding a non-conforming use. So it's tricky to capture that under the term churches. We might have to dig into it when we actually write out the code, but it might be worth discussing how you want to capture churches or semi-public use in existing areas or in R3s or in new areas, and figure out how you want to parse that out. But planning-wise, that's kind of going to be the issue, is how to capture an existing non-conforming use if you want to add on this accessory use to it.
Okay, thank
That
you.
makes sense.
Actually,
Oh.
that doesn't totally make sense to me. Because this language doesn't specify that a church, that it would be. I mean, do we?
It depends where it is. That's the tricky part. So if a semi-public use is allowed in R3 and you're saying it's okay in the church, then you wouldn't have to change anything. But
Okay.
if it's happening in a church now and you don't want it to happen in the future, then we'd have to figure out how to limit that non-conforming.
Separate those, okay.
use. Yeah.
Because a church is not spelled out as allowed in an R3.
Okay.
There's a
That's
dozen
the
of
tricky
them.
part.
Okay.
So if a semi-public use is allowed in a C4, it's no problem. But
The conditional uses right now, I should have brought this up. A boarding, rooming house, or other group housing not mentioned above, a bed and breakfast, a congregate care, a daycare center, a nursing home, a restaurant as an accessory use to an inn, or public or semi-public use. Those are already all allowed in an R3.
As conditional use.
As conditional. And there's no definition, I didn't see where a church was allowed anywhere.
So churches fall under semi-public use. That's how we calculate
Okay.
But there's a couple options. You could create a definition for a church, which is messy, or add some sort of language for accessory uses to semi-public use. I think would be a way to capture that. And I'm happy to write this out when we get to the actual code stage, because it's.
If you could, that would be great. Thank you, Nancy. Ms. Ferber.
So I have comments, thoughts. I would love to start them. I'd like to comment on Commissioner Mitchell's letter. The goal is not to go back to the beginning. The motivation for this code language was that when we considered the temporary use that the Astoria Warming Center came to us and asked for, we had no guidance in our development code. And so that was one motivating factor, was to create some guidance for a use like this in the development code. And then secondly was public feedback from the previous season when that particular warming center operated. And the guidance from the public was that they felt like it was a negative impact on the neighborhood. And the one thing that the comprehensive plan suggested we use as criteria was to prevent that very thing from happening. So with that two-pronged motivation, I constructed this code and introduced it, and we agreed to talk about it here. So the goal is not to make it impossible to have a warming center. It's not to prevent any existing warming centers from operating. It is to address the missing parts of our code and to address neighborhoods in general that may be impacted from this use. So since we've been talking about it, and that's to address Commissioner Mitchell's first comments about the trying to eliminate churches as a place to operate a warming center. That's not a goal. The second thing she addressed was the technical advisory, and I'll address Mr. Parkinson's comments too. I actually like referencing the technical advisory so the code that I constructed is quite literally verbatim from the technical advisory. All the exiting, all the fire safety, everything is word for word from that technical advisory. So it makes sense to refer to it as opposed to duplicating it. I don't know if are there issues?
Check on that one, yeah. It's a bit legal.
So if it's possible to do that, then great. If not, then we may have to duplicate it and just modify it if the fire marshal changes his mind or her mind. Now, in addition to the 11-14 technical advisory, there were other things added, and that was to address the concerns of the neighborhood, and that was the minimum threshold which would trigger the conditional use. And so that would give community development an opportunity to deal with a warming center that is disrupting the neighborhood. So that's the goal of the specific conditional use. So since our last discussion, we kind of left it talking about, actually, why don't can we step through the comments that from our previous meeting should be in our, what am I looking at? So the Word document with the comments on the side. Do you want to just step through that document? Yeah, from the top.
This is the one that says definitions at the top.
So there hasn't been any movement from the homelessness task force in creating a formal definition or anything. So I mean, we can just continue working with these definitions. I did change all the language to a temporary warming shelter, and that was to remove emergency, so it didn't conflict with if we ever come up with, emergency code for emergencies like earthquakes. I'm still comfortable with 10 being the number that would trigger a conditional use. Does anybody else have any thought on that minimum number?
I'm fine with that minimum number.
That would again allow a church or really any group to operate and house up to 9 people.
Without any needing to come in.
Right.
Okay.
So the question, that means that if a church was doing a very small scale, under 10, they
They would not be regulated
it
by
would
this.
not be regulated. It's not like it's an accessory use, it's just not covered.
That's just up to to the city, and it would be done how it is done now, where if there's complaints, you would probably be driven to get a temporary use.
Yeah.
As it,
I think it'd be good to note that they might be regulated by fire life safety issues, but it wouldn't be regulated by the zoning code.
Right.
It wouldn't be a blanket thing of, yes, you can house 10 people in your living room kind of deal.
Right.
But that might be good language to include, that
Yep.
it may require to conform to occupancy and fire life safety issues, or however you want to
Okay.
word it.
And Planner Ferber is distinguishing between zoning code and building code.
Right.
So something can be allowed under the planning code, but not under the building code, so. And vice versa.
you have a lot of notes written down over there. Did you have any comments on?
No, not on this. I was kind of just taking notes at some of the points that were made as
okay.
well. Yeah.
So then the last comment was the zones that would be listed as a conditional use in. And I think we left that after we started discussing R3 as a possibility. Now, I'm leaning toward now adding R3, but with special conditions for R3, and that is that there's a maximum number that's not set by the square footage. It's merely a density, a maximum occupancy, if you will. I think we saw, and this is kind of based on, you can call it anecdotal evidence, that since we don't have a lot of real solid studies or anything to base this on, but the warming center that has operated for 4 years, the third year seemed to be the most populous, and that was the one that generated the most response from the neighborhoods. And this year, I believe Mr. Parkinson said that they did you say averaged 25 or so?
Approximately, yes.
And there were, as I understand it, much fewer, if any, negative impacts or reported negative impacts on the neighborhood in which they operated, which was in R3. So I'm not against adding an R3 as long as we have a reasonable maximum. Again, the suggestion is that the larger the volume, the greater the chance for impact on the neighborhood. So I'll leave it there. Does anybody have thoughts?
Are you suggesting the max of something like 35? Is that what you were thinking, or
I would say more like 25.
25?
I'd like to object to the 25.
Mr. Parkinson, if you don't mind allowing the commission to discuss, and then we would be happy to reopen for comments after that. Thank you.
So Daryl, that would be per building, per facility.
Correct, for use. And that would apply only in the R3 zone.
Commissioner
Wow.
Herman?
How do you arrive at 25, Commissioner Moore?
Again, it's just based on the public feedback, where more than that, we got more negative feedback. We don't have lots of science to back it up. And anything that we would recommend, I would hope, would be reviewed, in a year or two, and those numbers would certainly be up for review.
I think that I like I'm glad to hear that you're open to considering including R3 in here. And I'm also like Commissioner Mitchell's suggestion of bringing in C4, because there are churches in that area that are buildings where a use like this would actually be practical. I think that it's been hard to disentangle this kind of code discussion from the experience of one particular instance. And I then wonder whether, if that 25 number is coming very specifically from the experience of, kind of 2 pretty different years, or 2 or 3 different years in one particular location, what that kind of, that we should at least weigh that with open eyes, that we're really kind of taking that number from that experience. I'm comfortable with with just the fact that this would be a conditional use, that we would have, I think that gives us a lot of control, a lot of opportunity for feedback from specific communities, specific neighborhoods where one of these uses might come into effect. I think not including R3 kind of makes this reflect maybe just one side of the public comment that we got, because there were definitely plenty of people that were, in favor of having it in an R3 zone when we originally had that conversation. And so putting the option of R3 and possibly also C4 in this, I think more does reflect the discussions that we had. I think that also gives us the opportunity to kind of view, these decisions as they come up, because they will be conditional uses, in the context of what we know will be our the evolving environment of services for homeless that we have here. And these kind of facilities are really just one, are really designed to be just one small part of what, facilities and services we offer to help get these people out of the situation that they're in. So I think that really kind of that public comment process part of a conditional use is what makes me comfortable having R3 and C4 be in this.
Just thinking about the number 25, there were far fewer problems this year, but that also is the same year when the warming center was required to follow through with a number of neighborhood agreement requests, or not requests, but requirements. So it's hard to know, were there fewer problems because of neighborhood agreement, or fewer problems because there weren't quite as many people? So that's something to consider.
I have considered it, yeah, whether it's, I assume it's management and volume combined, right? And so this would, would provide a management framework and limit the volume. So it seems like a recipe for success.
So if we're going to allow R3, I would question why not R1 and R2 as well.
That's certainly a question. I would reply with densities. So R1 and R2 are designed to be less dense, and this is a density use. So putting a large number of people in a small space is a high density thing, and that's what R3 is more built to handle. People who live in R3 are packed in a little tighter than those in R2 and R1. So just along the lines of sheer density, I would say R3 is, well, they may not, you can argue whether it's appropriate, it's more appropriate than R2 or R1, in my opinion.
So we could have this as a conditional use or an outright use in R1 or R2 with a lower number of people allowed in the shelter?
It can occur in R1 and R2 if it's 10 or fewer. So we wouldn't be restricting R1 and R2 from a smaller number. They can operate outside of the bounds of this regulation.
So should we allow larger numbers as a conditional use in R1 and R2?
I wouldn't.
Because
they can operate, a warming center would be able to operate in R1 and R2 with a number that seems more appropriate for those lower densities, which would be under 10.
How does anyone else feel?
I agree that R3 seems more appropriate. Part of that is because of land use, and part of it is when we think of facilities like this serving the community, a lot of the feedback we got during the public testimony for the last permit application was that the current location, aside from being kind of retrofitted for a use like this, it's also close to services and it's close to transportation services and other public services. So when you get out into R2 or R3, first of all, lower density. I think people who live out in lower density expect lighter use, lighter traffic. it'd be worth a discussion with R2, what might be the the limit that would trigger a conditional use if we want to allow more than 10 people. But I mean, my initial hunch is that 10 people is enough for R2 and R1. But I haven't had much time to think about it. And I mean, again, where those numbers are really coming from, need some time to think about that too without a whole lot of input.
I'm concerned though because density and income generally have an inverse relationship. So people with lower income live in higher density areas, and it's almost as though you're saying that people who live in higher density areas and have lower income shouldn't be concerned about the impact of a larger warming center. But people in R1 or R2 who have the higher income and a lower density then have the right not to have a larger population warming center in their neighborhood. And I'm not sure that that's, again, I'm throwing it out there and I would love to hear.
I was thinking more of the impact on a neighborhood. Someone who moves into high density residential is kind of expecting a lively neighborhood with foot traffic and things happening in the evenings. And medium density residential, I don't know, I mean, that's kind of a gray area. But the low density, people have moved there because they want it to be quieter, they want it to be less trafficked. And so just kind of serving that community and what their expectations were when they bought property there, if they're property owners. The other thing is if the warming center is serving a houseless population, then their vicinity to services, to public services is more important, and therefore it just seems like the denser use would be in those high density areas. Again, I don't feel really strongly about the R1 and the R2 at this point, having not had a whole lot of time to analyze that or do any research, but I could be convinced either way. I'm just leaning more toward focusing on R3, I guess.
I'm in agreement with Commissioner Henry about that. I wouldn't want higher numbers in the R1 or R2.
I'm sorry.
I agree with Commissioner Henry. I think it makes most sense in an R3 zone because of the proximity or likely proximity to services that people without a home would need. So
I'm thinking, and Mr. Moore has a map up and he may need to scroll in, but I'm thinking about the church on the top of the hill, 7th Street and Niagara, and then there's another church further down 7th Street. What is the zoning in those areas?
I think Niagara's is a border, isn't it? It must be.
Is that Niagara?
Yeah, it's R2.
So that's an R2.
Niagara. It's R1 north of Niagara and R2 south of it. On the hill there.
Okay, so heading down the hill then.
Mm-hmm.
So those two churches there. Well, then there's a few other churches then.
the church at 12th and Irving.
Right. Which is R2?
I'm not sure where the line is between R1 and R2.
It's on Irving, except for the one block.
So we would be depriving these churches of the opportunity to host a larger
To serve more than
warming
10.
center.
Where's the church on, is it on, which side of Irving is the church on?
It's on the south side, southwest corner of 12th and Irving.
It is R3, I believe.
I don't think so.
If it's on the south side of Irving, it's
Southeast, I
R1.
There's one at 10th and Irving as well, but on the north side.
Yeah, that's in R1. across the street is R3.
Would it be helpful to have a map with churches and the zoning?
That would be great, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I would point out that churches aren't the only place that can have these,
Right.
and
That's what
that
I'm kind of hearing is,
the traditional use of a church makes sense in a lot of ways. My experience in other areas is that the churches rotated the use, and they had a maximum of 10, so that there wouldn't be impact on the neighborhoods. And these churches were throughout the city. The actual homeless shelter that was a high barrier was in an industrial area, but the churches throughout the city in all sorts of different zonings had warming centers, and people would go into and out of those neighborhoods without any trouble.
Well, yeah, I'm glad we had this discussion, because the fact that there's, R3 on one side of Irving and R1 on the other, that's a little bit surprising. I kind of figured that it would transition to R2 and then R3, and that was generally how it went. And then your point about some of the churches that are in the R2 zone, I mean, that's still really close to downtown, and there is bus service on Niagara. So, maybe, how do we feel about R3 though? Are we still sort of toss out R3 or bring that in too? I mean, I could see having different thresholds between R2 and R3, sorry, R1, I meant. Do we want to say R1 is just 10 and don't worry about it, or try to bring in R1?
If we're comfortable with 25 and R3, I think stepping down R2 and R1 is, just go with 10. I mean,
I don't know that I'm comfortable with 25 in R3, but I think it's discriminatory to exclude other residential zonings.
again, we're not excluding them. We're setting a threshold at which a use will be regulated.
I guess we're just deciding if the threshold would be greater than 10 people. So, I mean, it seems like pretty easy code language to specify a threshold for each residential zone, if we want to include all of them.
you could also include them, just throw this out here, you could include it as a semi-public use, so anywhere where a church is, they could still operate, and then tack on a limit of, have 1,000-foot buffer between them, so you don't have two in the same area. There's ways besides just the zoning that you could limit.
I see. So you're saying that a temporary warming shelter would be part of a semi-public use,
Okay.
rather than delineating the zones in which a temporary warming structure is allowed. Okay, I think that I didn't understand the first time.
You don't have to, it's just not.
Yeah.
Because then that would capture, I mean, it makes it messier. I have all the messy ideas. It captures the churches in existing R1, R2, R3 zones. But I would recommend putting some sort of cap. I think in 25 I have concerns with, because what happens with that 26th person who comes in the door? But if there's not another shelter within 1,500 feet, I don't know what. To me, it makes more sense to limit it by distance and impacts to the neighborhood than the number of people at that site, because the number of people at the site would already be limited by all this fire life safety stuff. It's kind of where I'm thinking.
I was starting to think along those lines too, that, if you have several buildings in a small area and they're all allowed a certain number of people, it could have a pretty big impact on the neighborhood compared to forcefully spreading it out.
So how do we feel about time limits for these? As far as allowing a shelter to operate for a number of days before it has to be moved to a different location, so that there's sharing between the
Well, part of the motivations for creating this, as I stated before, was really to allow a single location to become more established. So that would be contrary to that, to allow investment in a location. Because it's expensive to operate a shelter. And presumably a lot of money comes from grants or donations, and it's hard. It seems to me it would be harder to generate grant money or donation money to improve a building if they're not going to be there in 6 months.
So is the intention of this code to protect neighborhoods or to make it easier for a warming center to be established somewhere?
Well, it's both. I mean, originally it was intended to allow a warming center to be established outside of neighborhoods with the intention of protecting neighborhoods. But now we're talking about adding R3, which would be in neighborhoods, which is why I think a capacity limit is important to make sure we're still addressing the neighborhood issue or protecting impact on the neighborhoods. So both.
Okay.
The requirement for a reapplication, that could help with the time limit issue, right? If it's not
I'm
work-
sorry.
The requirement for a reapplication for a conditional use could theoretically help with the time limit problem.
Do you have expiring
You know, if
conditional
it's-
uses, or are they perpetual?
Conditional uses stay with the site, but that's a good question of, you could have a temporary use, you require an annual renewal. I don't know if you can require it for a specific use, but I can look into it.
I know that there were some of us who wanted to avoid that process happening every year. I don't know if it could be bi-yearly or something, but it gives the neighborhood the opportunity to come and give public testimony and to speak against the renewal of the permit if things start going south.
Well,
Or
our hope is-
neighborhoods if we have multiple
Yeah.
warming centers.
Yep,
Thank you.
yeah.
Our hope is that the conditional use process, like it does everywhere else, you make that determination early on, and then if they violate the specific use standard, then there's ways to enforce it. So like any conditional use, if they don't follow the rules of the conditional use, they can lose the use, or they can be fined, or whatever, however the city wants to address it.
But the use isn't the definition of the use is not as stringent or extensive or detailed as the good neighbor agreement commitment.
Yeah,
You know, I mean, that was their,
it should have captured
okay.
most of that.
Okay.
Well, again, we kind of keep going back and forth between trying to write code for the entire city that's supposed to benefit the residents and trying to work an existing entity in, which we all agreed up front isn't supposed to be the intent of this exercise. So,
That's our challenge.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to work any existing entity in or exclude any existing entities. I'm trying to come up with a standard that would apply to any that wants to operate, that allows the use to serve the goal of the use, which is to help the people that need the help without impacting the neighborhoods that they're in. That's my goal.
and I agree with that. I'm saying that there is an existing warming center that has been operating, and we can learn from that, but we can't write this code specifically to
All right.
fit that in. And we've had this conversation on a lot of different subjects, not just warming center, but other entities or proposed businesses.
Yeah.
So we do.
But I do think the discussion of residential.
I wasn't finished, but
I apologize.
Because we have had people in here state there's the potential that something that's existing might work, but when it changes ownership or changes management, then it's a different situation. So we do have to be careful that whatever we are recommending here has to do with a general and generic and not something specifically.
Yeah. And I think that's actually kind of where it's hard to find the balance is Daryl, Commissioner Moore, I do understand the desire to separate the facilities from the neighborhoods. But I think what would make me comfortable with it, I also have a desire to allow it, but what would make me more comfortable with it is not an outright conditional use that stays with the facility indefinitely. Is there a way to address that? Because kind of the whole management.
I think it's called a temporary use permit.
Yeah, same.
We already have that.
Can it stay with the operator, the organization operating the
Well,
warming
again,
center?
you can have a change of management. I mean, what we've seen is that under 10 isn't a problem. Or our experience here was that under 10 wasn't a real problem. 35 was. And it was the same entity, but there was a very different management from year 1 and 2 to year 3.
Okay, yeah.
And then a change in how management operated between year 3 and year 4. So again, we can look at that and recognize, again, we can use that experience to make decisions, but we have to remember that everything can change within that organization.
Well, I guess as long as the, kind of the rules, if we just double check and Commissioner Moore, I trust you if you said that you captured everything, but if the requirements are strict enough that non-conformance or non-compliance can be enforced, then that's a powerful tool, as long as it's not too difficult to enforce.
Nancy, do you have any thoughts on how that could be done, or?
I don't know legally, I mean, code enforcement wise, yes, if there are issues, we'll follow up on them. And I think that good neighbor agreement worked pretty well with the existing warming center as a model.
It was a good neighbor commitment.
Sorry. Commitment. I'm wondering if there's a way to require administrative review for something that gets like a warming center goes in and requires staff review it a year later instead of sending it back to planning commission like a whole temporary use permit, but somehow have a report required or somehow capture impacts of the neighborhood without just giving a blanket, yes, you're good for forever conditional use permit. It's kind of my
Well,
thought, and I don't know if that's legally required, but.
Given the nature of it, I'd like to see the neighborhood having the opportunity for public input.
Mm-hmm. And if it was an administrative review, it would go out for public notice, we'd write a report, we'd allow people to comment, but it wouldn't have to go through a whole planning commission process. It'd be a shorter notice, but still with, it would be a shorter process, but still with public input involved.
How does the public input work in something like that?
It's
Thank you.
something like, good question, like what we do for administrative variance requests. So variances that are really big, over 10% I take to you guys, something like a side yard setback is in our code that is processed administratively. So if I get a lot of pushback from neighbors, I could always pop it up to planning commission or deny for this example, deny a variance for a side yard setback. But if it's not a problem, it's a foot and they have 20 feet kind of thing, it's the type of thing we specifically want to keep out of planning commission because it doesn't require that level of review. So there's technically 3 levels of review for land use processes. You guys see the level 3 and 4, but 1 and 2 happen at the staff level. So for 2, what I'm describing, not describing this well, sorry. For something like a side yard setback, we send out public notice to the property owners within a certain buffer, and they can write or call in, and if they have concerns, then it's logged, and I include it in the staff report, and if they don't have concerns, we just process it through.
But then is there a public hearing?
Not unless it gets escalated up for some reason, or they appeal it. It's also appealable. So if they disagree with the staff decision, they could appeal it to planning commission.
Okay. I would still like to see an annual review
Like administrative like this or?
through the planning commission, through a public hearing so that again, both sides have an opportunity to.
I agree with you on that.
So a conditional use wouldn't give you that.
I'm sorry,
A conditional use wouldn't come back every year.
but a temporary,
You could require it in a conditional use.
and we see Lisa Nelson every year.
That's
Well,
a temporary.
she's a temporary use.
So that's,
But it's a good legal question if you could require them to come back with just a report every year instead of renewal for the whole conditional use permit. Just report back on something. I don't know. It's a legal land use issue. I don't know enough right now about.
so.
So what about an annual administrative review where this, instead of a conditional use, is appended to semi-public use in all zones except in residential, it's conditional use.
Say that again?
I didn't say that very well. I'm very interested in a public hearing in residential neighborhoods. So anything that would occur in a residential neighborhood, I would want to come to planning commission. But in the other zones listed, can it just be administrative?
Are you talking about the initial decision process or a year
The initial.
review? Okay.
And annual. And reviews, if we decide reviews are necessary.
That's a good idea. It's possible.
I mean, we would be making it outright use in the
It's
other
possible.
zones, right?
I'm looking, for example, in R2, you're talking about R2, not just R3 for residential?
Just R3 is my interest, but I'm only one person.
If we tied it to semi-public uses, they're already conditional in R2 and R3. So those would automatically be going to planning commission anyway. So you have that public input. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
So this raises another question. If you can't have two conditional uses on the same. So
But
if
you might-
semi-public use is conditional,
Yep, you
Then-
might be able to tack it on as an accessory use, which is
accessory use.
messier.
Good times.
Accessory to the conditional.
Well, an accessory to
So
a
I'm-
semi, so let's say you have a conditional use permit for a semi-public use in an R2, your church are there already, or you have a conditional use permit for it, you could tack on an accessory use for it and require that for the review.
Okay, I'm going to point out that it is currently 7:44, and these chairs are considerably more uncomfortable than at City Hall, and I have a hard time spending an hour sitting in those chairs. So we're going to take a 5-minute recess, and we will reconvene at somewhere between 7:49 and 7:50.
There's not a lot of space between there. Ow, my butt.
Yeah.
Did you look at semi-public uses? I wonder if that's an easier way to streamline this.
Say that again.
Did you look at semi-public uses and which zones are required?
No, every time I'm like, ooh, that sounds like a good idea, somebody suggests something else. I'm like,
It's a formula of humidity.
I kind of like that. So then,
Yeah. And they,
how would that work?
in the
But that's sort of where I'm
afternoon, and
thinking
then
instead of
close in the
nitpicking
late
which
evening.
zone it is and code it and then
I
existing
like
use
the
that's
idea
already.
of
So let
1,000
me look and see where semi-public.
separation.
Which I think would be interesting to bring back in a chart, you know, have a zoning map of where the churches are and then
Tell you why I like that
a
idea.
chart of where semi-public uses are.
They need a warming center down by St. Paul. And they need a warming
A
center.
conditional use.
Yeah.
And
That's
if you go
then,
this code, this is.
Like a lot of churches have conditional uses because they've already been there before.
Let's find it.
Or are they just grandfathered
They're
in for that
grandfathered.
use?
Let's
Yeah.
find it.
So you would apply for a conditional use if that
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
congregation
I like-
left and a new congregation wanted to go into that
Only
existing
if
church.
they ceased operation for 2 years.
Only if they cease, but I thought that a
That
conditional use was non-transferable.
It's not, but you have to have it in continual use, I think. Same way if you're an existing owner.
Survives with the use, right?
Duplex, yeah, so if it dies, if you have a dance studio.
So the semi-public use dies with the church. So example, if a congregation left and it's in a residential neighborhood and you decide to have could you have a semi-public use there then?
That's the quarter.
It depends if it was
Yeah,
continuing or if it was new.
Right, there's seven
So if it was a
So what do you mean?
nonprofit moving in, it would be different than that congregation.
Yeah.
you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, semi-public, semi-public. Like, why can't you put a dance studio in a church and let's say the dance studio is nonprofit? It's a non-conforming building, and now you're in a pickle. I mean, this is the whole problem.
Yeah.
They're repurposing it.
Depends if they're expanding the use or not. There's a whole lot about.
All right.
You know, just.
Non-conforming maybe changed to conforming.
If you take.
But you can't make it worse.
You can't
make it worse, you can't make it.
And then how do I turn them off then?
Because 100 divided by 4.
But how is a dance studio less conforming than a bad church?
If it was a nonprofit.
I was gonna say,
A non-profit profit shouldn't bear any weight on it, that's just a business structure. I mean, why don't if I turn my house into a nonprofit, what do I do there then? I get nothing.
Yeah, they need to work through it.
Yeah, I just want to bring.
Yeah, I tried.
I freshened up.
I noticed that
It's everywhere,
Last year.
semi-public.
That is conditional.
Because I like this stuff that between
You could tack on,
I asked the question, I see what coming.
parallel it with semi-public, but add on good neighbor commitments and a renewal and buffer.
Get my watch, both my
So you
watches
can't
are
have more
dead.
than one.
Both of my watches are
Oh, is this
dead.
The buffer
No,
needs to be
no, it's
addressed.
fine.
The buffer needs to be addressed.
My daughter needs these, no, I just.
Well, that's why I wanted conditional use, because then you can
Lost
consider.
about it, I'm like, what time am I supposed to be back?
It's so complicated. Why is it so complicated?
you didn't miss much.
Okay, yeah, I thought it was only one.
So, semi-public is conditional in MHFA, HC, CA, HRA, AHMP, R1, R2, CR, C1, C2, C3, S2,
Not S2.
outright in C4.
That makes sense. That's how we have a library downtown.
Okay, we're reconvening at 7:49 PM. Is this still on?
Yeah.
So someone had 5 minutes of dead air? Okay. We could go back and tell them, take a 5-minute break. 4 minutes and 30 seconds and they should be good. Okay, we are back, and where were we?
So I'm less interested in that plan now,
Michael?
with the semi-public use, because it's all over the city.
It's a good plan for a minute.
So we are on the record, and if we
Yes.
could all speak so that the tape can, since we don't have microphones this evening, if we could
Thank you,
all
sir.
speak. So the tape can pick it up, and then so that your hearing impaired chair can hear what you've said.
So we talked briefly about somehow stapling it to a semi-public use, because, but the problem we might encounter doing that is that semi-public use is conditional in almost every zone. So it would be, we'd have to make the same kinds of, we'd have to do the same amount of work, code language wise, if we just created a new one and put it in the zones, as opposed to selecting the zones where semi-public use already is conditional and eliminating ones that we didn't think were appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm kind of leaning back toward a specific conditional use standard.
I will say I was somewhat interested in the idea of the outright use that could, or the conditional use, which doesn't undergo yearly review unless, except for the administrative review, and it only goes before the planning commission if it gets elevated to the planning commission. Because that sort of solves the goal of not having to go through planning commission yearly, but it still allows for it to go through the planning commission yearly if it gets elevated to that level because of problems.
I'm not 100% sure my plan is legal, but I think that would be an interesting thing to at least pursue, or let me talk to Blair about.
I like the temporary use. Again, going back to our experience is that when there is not a problem with the use, it takes about 3 minutes.
Yeah, that's the other thing, that's true. If it's not highly controversial,
it's-
you don't sit there for hours listening to public
Right, and if it
testimony.
is highly controversial and needs to have public input, then that should be allowed. So,
The problem, excuse me, but the problem with temporary use is that there's no enforceable language specific, pardon me, I got an ice cube, specific to this particular use in the temporary use. So enforcement of problems once the temporary use has been granted becomes a lot more difficult.
Except that it gets reviewed every year.
It does get reviewed every year.
Yeah. So we have that opportunity to address problems every year.
Would it make it more difficult for an organization to seek grants, or if they aren't certain whether they'll be able to stay in a certain place from one year to the next?
I think that's a fair assumption. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm working on that assumption.
but we're back to, should that be a consideration for how we write the code, or how we recommend that the code be written?
I wouldn't want to write code that makes it difficult for the use that we're writing code for. I mean, if the goal is to enable a use, we should potentially consider lines of thought like that.
For renewal language?
I'm sorry.
For renewal?
No, what Commissioner Herman was talking about.
Yeah.
No, I'm not sure if I'm following.
We're bouncing around.
I know,
think.
but my understanding, if it's a temporary use, would be, so if we decided that we wanted to continue to consider temporary warming shelters as a temporary use, as the Astoria Warming Center is, then we would not have need any code language. Is that correct? Or?
They're currently operating under a temporary use permit,
Right,
which lasts for a year.
right.
And then they have to come back and get another one. As an example, the Astoria Warming Center is operating that way.
Right.
And any other warming center that wanted to operate that was potentially at the scale where the city thought they should get a temporary use permit, they would have to do the same thing.
Right, but the point or there's no way to have, because any language like this in the development code would be tied to a conditional use or an accessory use, and thus, if we have language like this, it could not be a temporary use, because temporary uses are for things that aren't already classified in our development code. Is that right?
Pretty much.
So it's one or the other. Is that what-
And I assume we're working on long histories of, we can't just create a whole new category of use, like
Between
temporary conditional use. I mean, I assume we aren't, we can't.
That was sort of my idea with adding some level of administrative
Reviewable
review,
conditional
yeah.
use.
Which I'm not sure, I'd have to double check.
I haven't heard of that. But,
I would.
right, so a conditional use would be permanent
Right.
with the use and the ongoing operation.
An ongoing operation, yeah. So as, Commissioner Herman was pointing out, the advantage to someone who wanted to run a warming center would be that a conditional use would allow them to plan for the future. We do have, as we all noted, temporary uses that have renewed year after year and have been just fine. But I suppose that is something that can only be relied upon after a certain number of renewals for an organization.
So the question of the grants is if someone operates in an area where it's an outright allowed use, then they don't have to worry about getting the temporary, and they can get their grants. So it's not as though a shelter can't operate or can't get grants. They still have that opportunity if they're going to be in a permanent location in zoning that would allow it as an outright use.
Right. Which is what we're considering now.
But we aren't considering any outright uses, right?
Well, conditional use, right.
Okay,
Right, that's what I
Yeah.
was thinking. I was like, wait.
because there were no outright uses.
There's no outright. It's not outright.
It's just unregulated.
It's not proposed to be an outright use anywhere.
Got it.
Proposed to be a conditional use.
Unless it's under 10.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, then it's none of our business.
Okay, where would we like to go with what we have, and where would we like to go with the rest of the meeting tonight?
Should we request more information about our options?
You want to hear from the public too?
Sure. And prior to Mr. Parkinson arriving, I did point out that this is a workshop. I'm not required to do a public hearing, but I'm happy to get public input, and I would just ask again that people keep their remarks. We generally ask for a 3-minute, but I'm happy to go beyond that this evening. So, if you don't mind coming back, just stating your name for the record.
Dan Parkinson. And I live over on the other side of the river. Do you want the same address?
Could you please?
550 State Route 401, Nace-Hill, Washington. The couple of comments, things that I had thought of, that was brought up here, and I thought there were some good ideas. I think 1,000-foot separation might be a really good thing, because if the population grows here, you're encouraging other neighborhoods to share the burden. For instance, I think there's a need down towards Safeway, and I think there's a need towards Dutch Brothers Coffee. And I think that rather than having things concentrated, I think that puts an undue burden on any one neighborhood. And I think if that was written into the code, I think that would help separate. It would support the need in other areas. I don't know how the code would deal with this, but the typical operation of a warming center spans 2 years, because it goes from November to March. So I don't, if you take out a permit and it's to January 1, I'm not sure how that works.
I think in this case, we would consider it a season.
Okay.
Not a calendar year,
Okay.
but a season.
Yeah. If there was a way to have different levels of review, if the city's intention is to have these things more likely located in Cs and Is and some of the other zones besides residential zones, if you had a different review criteria, kind of like Nancy was suggesting, it would influence them to go to the area of least resistance. So in the R3, it's a heavier, in the residential zones, it's a heavier burden, and an industrial zone is a lighter burden. For instance, behind Dutch Brothers down in that area, there's a Quonset hut building down in there. I don't know what size it is. I'm just, if that was a less burden, it would more likely locate there for a whole variety of reasons, including funding and neighborhood resistance and things like that. As far as problems I think it's important that a warming center not use the model that was used last year, which was that board and that decisions was that we were going to open for 120 days, which is a violation of state fire code, and basically come on, move in, you live here, because it wasn't weather dependent. And I think it's important to continue to keep the weather dependent. The operation this year was completely different than last year based on that neighborhood commitment and defining the weather dependent 90 days, because nobody moves in when you don't even know if you can come back tomorrow. And I think the neighborhood experience was substantially different this year from last year.
Mr. Parkinson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but to clarify for the record and for those speaking, would it be okay if we called it year 3 and year 4?
Yes.
So year 3 was the year.
Year 3 was against fire code. It was against the definition of a warming center. It should not happen again.
And year 4 is the year, the season that you just completed,
Right.
season 4, however we want to, but.
Yeah. Now, as far as the 25, and I think this is a really key point, if you take 4 nights, a 30, a 30, a 30, and a 10, it adds up to 100 divided by 4, that's 25. That was our experience this year. What would happen is we would be at capacity, be at capacity, be at capacity. The next night there was a big storm coming in. The weather model said we could open, but it turned out to be a sunny day, 55. The storm didn't hit, nobody showed up. And so it was 30, 30, 30, 10. And I think the neighborhood experience with the staffing at a warming center, excuse me, I'm sorry. The staffing at a warming center, the state fire code will make the staffing be at the level that this current year was operated at, because you have to have a fire watch, you have to have 2 people on throughout the whole time period. And I think that the 30 number was well managed, just as well managed as the 10 number. I'm concerned, as someone mentioned, at 25 people, you're on the only time you need 30 people is when it's, or a larger number, is when it's really bad nights. And so to take an average on the warm weather nights that are unexpectedly warm, you don't need 25. But on the bad weather nights, you're cutting people off that really do need the services. And I just think that 25 number is a little low. So I think we covered last year, more than 1 year, the R3, the residential review versus the industrial or commercial use, and the 1,000% furniture. I think that's all my comments.
Great, thank you. Any other comments?
Chris,
If you could come up to the front, state your name and address for the record.
Chris Hafer, 687
Mr. Hafer, we are on the record and it does need to be.
687 12th Street. So it's a little confusing about all of the conditional use and temporary use. And repurposing buildings in the R3 zone, which is specifically what I want to kind of get a little more clarity on. So some of the churches that were mentioned are non-conforming, and most of their non-conforming has to do with parking. Probably parking. So if we take parking out of the equation for one business model, and I understand the need for the warming shelter and all, but are we going to take parking away from other business models too, just to make it fair? Because housing is the main issue here, and parking is the main issue that's really hindering expanding some of our housing. So, I would like to see that worked in and discussed, along with lot size you should probably consider changing.
So you're concerned about a precedent being set by?
Correct.
Okay.
Also, I'm kind of wondering about how the shelters are defined, and are there different types of shelters that give different services, and are all of them going to be recommended for the R3 zone, or are we going to define them a little bit on how they're functioning? And also getting back to whether or not a shelter can be in other neighborhoods. Astoria is not very big, so I kind of have a hard time accepting the fact that things are very far away, because Astoria is very small. You look at the Ebowicks Church, which is in the R1 zone, just up off of Glasgow. It could be a great facility for a warming center because it's on 5 lots. They have parking, and it needs some fixing up. So I could see that as being a potential location for this use. And yeah, I think that's about all I have. I think one thing that I noticed with all transient housing this year is that compared to last year, it was weather related. And this last year we had a slightly milder winter, and the year before it was much harsher. And I think that's shown up also in our tourism and possibly in shelters. I don't know. I don't have that data, but it's something to think about. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hafer. You make a very good point about the definition of services that they're going to offer. I was going to point out to you, well, we have a definition here, but the definition
It's very broad.
is I was going to say vague or broad, right? It just says a shelter that accommodates more than 10 homeless per operating day and meeting specific conditional use standards.
Which is the 3 pages of explanation.
Right, but it doesn't define.
I mean, is it low barrier? Is it men's shelter, women's shelter, family shelter?
What services?
Children's homeless group. I mean, there are many different nonprofit models for catering to the homeless. And, that might also need to be or maybe you want to touch base on it, discuss it.
Which, it's a good point. The warming centers that I was familiar with in a different life provided basically just a warm place, coffee and broth. And Jan isn't here this evening, but she has made it clear that she is disturbed by my suggestion of broth. That was in the Red Cross code, and that was that was shown to the neighborhood before season 1. We were told that there would not be meals served, that it would be coffee and broth, and it was just to provide a place for the people to get out of the weather. And the warming centers that I was familiar with before, the same thing, that it was coffee and broth and just a shelter to get out of the weather. And again, those were warming centers that were capped at 10 and moved from place to place throughout the season, and open only as necessary, the weather dependent. So I appreciate your comment on that, Mr. Hafer. And then I would also agree about the transportation.
I may have missed that edit. I think we talked about eliminating the parking requirement at our last meeting.
We did talk about it at the last meeting.
Because it's still in here that that parking
Okay.
would be required. And I don't
Where is
think,
that?
the very last thing before the zone changes. And I think
there you
I'm fine striking that altogether.
But getting back to the transportation, I would say that in my day, in my workday, business day, however you want to define it, I'm generally walking, and I do see different people in different places, but on those days when I do drive to our sober living facility on the South Slope or my other properties that are not necessarily in walking distance, it's amazing the number of people that I will see 3 miles from where I saw them earlier. I'll see someone at Safeway, and then I'll see them on the South Slope. So I don't know that transportation for most is that big of an issue, because we really are a small town. And then it's not just, I see my neighbors and so on from one end of town to another. I have a friend that walks about 7 miles a day and goes past my property on the South Slope that I don't want to walk to, but he does as part of his morning routine. So I think that transportation in the town, in a town of this size, isn't as big of a concern as it might be if the town were a lot larger. So we are back to, I'm sorry. Rick, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Okay. Thank you. So Mr. Moore, where would you like to go with this?
So I agree, an annual review, if we can somehow get that in, reporting on, opening it up to public comment and getting a report on the numbers that were served in the season, like a general report. We can come up with some format from whatever warming center is being reviewed. I can tweak this language and yank out all of the duplicate text or isolate it better. That text that was duplicated from the technical advisory, and we can refer to that technical advisory and include it, or however we can legally put that together.
Gotta check on that one, yeah.
You might have to duplicate it anyway. I like the idea of a buffer. I don't know that we actually specifically talked about it, but it was mentioned. But if one is operating in this location and we don't want another one across the street, because that kind of negates our neighborhood impact goals. So if we have a buffer so that they're more spread out.
Do you have a number in mind for that?
Is there?
Bend has 1,000 feet, but I don't know if that makes sense for our size.
How many feet is the city block?
Good question, Joan.
I'm
So
just trying to get a sense of that.
So in the grid, say between 8th and 11th, we are 200 feet
Per block.
per block, and I believe a 60-foot right-of-way, say between the property line and property line with curb gutter sidewalk, and so those are short blocks, and that's an unusual. Usually they're a lot longer, and then you get into some neighborhoods at the couplet there where we are. They're a little bit longer because they kind of put them together, and then there are neighborhoods. Alameda is a really unusual block because it starts, down at the Doughboy, and the 300 block, you're driving what would normally be 6 or 7 blocks, and you're in the 300 block, and you keep on driving and driving and driving, and by the time you get to the 600 block, you've gone a long distance,
Yeah.
where the difference between 1st and 6th downtown is very short.
1,000 feet's fine.
So it would be approximately 5 blocks, or 4 blocks, I guess, when you
Downtown.
consider
It's over a third
the
of a
right-of-way.
mile. It's over a third of a mile, and a third of a
Okay,
mile
thank
is
you.
like a third of a mile is like what, a 5-minute walk, 7-minute walk, 8-minute walk, something like that. Just to give it.
1,000 feet is a little under 20% of a mile.
Oh, sorry.
I would feel
So is that
comfortable with
even?
1,000.
1,000 yards would be over a third.
mile?
Over a third of a mile. So then, I'm still a proponent of a limit in R3, if we're gonna include R3. This hasn't been mentioned, but actually, Mr. Parkinson suggested the zones that were originally listed, the AHHC, C3, HR, LS, and S2, if we consider those zones the most appropriate for a warming center or warming shelter, could we just make those outright uses? Make it an outright use in those zones and conditional use in C3 and R3?
I also would like a little bit more time to think about that because I like that idea as well. I like the idea of making some kind of, code incentive to put things where we think they're most appropriate.
I would concur with that.
That makes sense.
On
Is
that-
there no outright use category for a shelter?
This temporary warming shelter doesn't exist in the code right now. That's one of the issues we're trying to address
And we're not proposing an outright use,
so far.
except for unregulated under 10 people. I'm just curious while we're on the topic of zones. So for conditional use versus temporary use, where do we want to put C4? Do we want to talk about C4, which is currently not on the list for conditional use in the 5 zones that were listed at the end?
I would include that in the outright column.
So it would be number
C4.
6 would be C4.
Yeah.
And then it's really just the R zones that we're trying to figure out.
Well, R3 and C3 and conditional.
Hang on, so are you saying 1 through 5 is outright plus C4 for outright and then conditional in R?
Conditional in R3 and C3.
Okay.
And I can update all this into it.
And I would still be interested in seeing that in other residential zones, at least R2.
The same maximum capacity? And are we still on board with 25, or do we?
I think 25 is a little high, but I've seen it work.
And what about in R2? What would you have in R2?
What is the density difference between R2 and R3? Is it 2/3?
For units, I think it's 26 in R3 and 16 in R2? 16 units per net acre in R2 and 26 in R3.
So approximately 2/3. 15.
40.4%.
You're right, Daryl, but
So 15 in
15.
R2?
I'm thinking about it.
and what is the density in R1? Is that 6 units per acre?
8.
8. So we're already
Below 10.
below 10 at that point, so.
Yeah. But that's the units. Never mind.
It's different here.
Yeah. Is that a yes or a no for R2?
I would say a 15 for R2.
Okay.
that's new to can we have everyone comment on that?
Sure.
I'm comfortable with that. I had kind of been thinking along those lines earlier when we were trying to think about what the threshold would be if we included R2.
So again, we don't have to make a decision tonight, but we can review that, have some time to think about it.
Yeah, I'm fine with using that for now and spending some time to think about it.
Okay.
I will include that in the edits.
Do we have anything else?
I just want to say one thing. I do personally feel like the definition of homeless at the top of the code, and then the definition of a temporary warming shelter, and then you get into the purpose, description, operation. I think that's sufficient. I think that this is good language.
I think it's pretty specific.
I do
A warming
too.
shelter also.
And I actually like how it doesn't discuss it doesn't need to discuss, the genders or different family arrangements. I mean, it defines an adult and a family, and I think that's good.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Henry. If no one else has anything, we will end the work session and go to reports of officers.
I have nothing to report, sir.
I have nothing to report.
Thank you.
I have nothing to report.
Nothing? Nothing? Okay, new business. Does anyone have anything that they wanted to bring up on new business?
I wanted to say thank you to the senior center for hosting that.
Yes, we will. We'll have to
Formally.
maybe invest in some new chairs. One thing I wanted to bring up while we were talking here, and I wanted to thank each of the individuals that spoke this evening from the audience. Mr. Parkinson brought up the Quonset hut down closer to the point there. There are a lot of layers to the housing crisis, as it were, in our area. During the winter and the very bad months, we need housing for people who might not otherwise survive. And during the summer, we need housing for people that do seasonal jobs that come in. The hard part is that as a housing provider, between April 1st and June 30th, I get constant calls for people who need something just for a few months, and then they're gone. And it's hard to then try to figure out if we should hold something open for someone that might need seasonal housing after that, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. And so it's always a question of, okay, where do we house the people who come in to do the seasonal work, namely the fish processing plants. And again, sometimes those seasons are a little unusual as well, not just in the summer, but so I'm wondering if there's the potential for a warming center, one that exists or doesn't yet, to work with the people who employ the seasonal workers to have a location where they could share. And for part of the year, it could be the warming center, and for part of the year, it could be a dormitory type. The seasonal workers that we get, that we rent to, go from engineers and people higher up the pay grade that want and expect their own place and a nice place and so on, and their employers will provide that because they need them on the job. And then the seasonal workers that we get, they ask how many they can cram into a unit because all they need is a bed. They work extremely long hours and then they just come home in extremely long hours and sometimes not on a fixed schedule. They just need a bed to crash in and then they go back to work. So it would seem that there are some seasonal workers that are the hardest to get the housing for that would fit well into the type of facility that a warming center would provide. And I just wonder if there's the possibility of having some sort of agreement between them for places that would provide that level of housing. That's a thought that I had. So
That's a great idea.
That's really interesting. So you're going to write a specifically conditional use standard for seasonal housing?
I would love to have the time and the skill to do that. Mr. Moore, you seem to have a higher level of skill along those lines than I do. I don't know about how much time you have in your schedule. I know that I don't, but it's just a thought to put out there, something to consider.
Can I clarify one thing? Did you want to have another work session before we put this out as a code amendment, or move forward with actual code amendment language with the changes discussed tonight?
How do the commissioners feel? Want one more meeting?
Yeah.
Maybe a
Or
little
work
I
session.
don't feel like we really solved anything in
abbreviated? I'm sorry.
I don't feel like we really solved anything. I mean, we got closer.
I do.
And we, okay, we solved some things. I don't think we solved it. But, you know, if you
Well,
could
I think we made a
plan
lot of
our
progress.
fervor to give us some answers to some of the questions we had.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just process-wise, we have to notice it differently, so I'm fine with that.
Okay.
So another work session then. Great.
Great.
Okay. Staff updates.
No, we have our usual meeting scheduled next month. I think we just have a conditional use permit and then the work session on that one, unless you want to bump it to another month. But I think I can pull it together by then.
I heard a rumor that City Council has directed the Planning Commission to review potential changes to the ADU policy. Is
Yes.
that accurate?
Yes, sorry, I forgot about that one. Yes, so the ADU policy had a clause in it that needed to be reviewed by council 1 year later. That rolled around in April. And then council reviewed it, had some notes, and then is sending it back down to Planning Commission. So that will be in the next few months. We're pretty busy in the planning office right now. But any codes or changes then will get forwarded back up to council for adoption.
Great. Any other public comments? Not related to the agenda? All right. We will find ourselves adjourned at 8:29.